Hello chess friends and welcome to the Chess channel and welcome back to the Tata Steel Masters in 2022. So we're now already in the round 7 of the super event and we're following now the derby of the day, which is of course the match between Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa and Magnus Carlsen. Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa is of course one of the most talented players in the world, but today he faced the shark Magnus Carlsen, and I think Magnus is back because he won his game yesterday with the white pieces against Richard Rapport. So Magnus took the lead and has now, I think, a comfortable situation, especially for instance if he wins now this game, he could be maybe even the only one who has 3 wins so far in the super event. So it was now a big chance for Magnus Carlsen to separate himself from the rest of the competition. So let's check out what happened. It was a brilliant and brutal game because here we have a Queen's Gambit accepted game by Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces. So let's check out now what happened. So here Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa opened with the move d4. We have d5 by Magnus Carlsen, c4, and we have now the move e6, and if with knight to f3 here Magnus Carlsen played a very interesting idea, d takes c4. And okay, this is now Queen's Gambit accepted style, of course, in this pawn on c4 is very hard to defend in the continuation of the game. But the most important thing I think about the Queen's Gambit accepted lines is to decoy the bishop here to c4, and then with a6 b5 you could get some extra tempi, extra time against this bishop, because then you can also expand here with the potential move c5. So here in the continuation we have normal ideas, e3 in order to recapture the pawn on c4, a6. Here is this preparation. If you take bishop to c4, then b5 could happen immediately. Here bishop to c4, and Magnus changed a little bit the opening theory. Of course b5 is an immediate opportunity, then bishop to e2, and maybe even knight from b to d7, then c5 our opportunity, bishop to b7. So these are still normal moves, I think, of the Queen's Gambit accepted. But here Magnus Carlsen didn't want to challenge the bishop immediately. He's probably hoping maybe the white to play the move a4, which would be of course a blockade idea to prevent this move b5. But if you do that, of course, then you have several weaknesses here on c3, b3, b4. So of course if you expand, then you cannot retreat again with the pawn, then you have created several weaknesses. So that's why Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa played, I think, a decent normal idea castling so far. We have now c5 by Magnus Carlsen immediately. We have b3 because b3 is very important, because now the actual threat, if you play something like, I don't know, knight to c3, then the problem is you get b5, you get maybe this one, bishop to e2, and even with c4 I think white can pass through, or here with the move b4 the knight could get challenged. So these are very tricky ideas. So that's why you don't want to get out with your knight very early. So that's why with the move b3 now, okay, you could play maybe the move b5, but now after move bishop to e2 or bishop to d3, c4 is not an opportunity, because you have this very important control of the square. So these are the tiny little things in the opening. And here Magnus Carlsen didn't play b5, he played b6, which is a more positional line, I think. He keeps the pawn structure compact on the queen side, and now he's trying to play bishop to b7 and get use, of course, of this very nice diagonal. But here Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa played, I think, a beautiful opening theory, bishop to a3, because if you take c takes d4, then bishop to f8 happens, and here if you play king to f8, then your castling privileges are out. You cannot castle anymore, and you think, I think you lose too much time in order to secure the king g6, king to g7 has to be idea. Meanwhile, of course, white can develop the minor pieces. So that's why after bishop to a3 Magnus played knight to d7, because if Magnus would not have played the move knight to d7, let's say bishop to e7, then of course d takes c5 could happen. And if you play bishop to c5, bishop to c5, b takes c5, you see now you're left simply with this weak pawn on c5. This is not something that you want to get in an early stage of the game. Such a weak pawn, in such an isolated pawn, of course, is of course a long-term weakness. So that's why knight from b to d7, if you want to play now, of course, here d takes c5, then bishop to c5, bishop to c5, knight to c5, queen takes d8, king takes d8, and everything I think is perfectly fine. King to c7, there's not a good way, I think, for white to attack the position immediately. You can maybe get the tempo, but now king to e7, king to c7, whatever you do, I think black is perfectly fine. Bishop to b7 will happen, and then you can compete here with rook to d8 also here on this very important d file. So that's why knight from b to d7, very important move. But here with this move, you have lost a little bit the connection between the queen and the d5 square. That's why here Praggnanandhaa uses this moment immediately in order to get this bishop centralized here after e takes d5, bishop to d5. And okay, if you try knight to d5, queen to d5, still you have to escape with your rook somewhere. And I think now with the move bishop to b2, you have really trouble to develop yourself. Bishop to e7 is not an opportunity because your g7 is weak. If you play knight to f6, then queen to d8, king takes d8, and then bishop to f6, I think is also decent idea. G takes f6, and okay, white is here 2 knights versus 2 bishops, but I don't like this messed up pawn structure of blacks. These are clear targets then, of course, for white in the continuation of the game. So I think that white is much better here. So that's why I have to move bishop to d5. Magnus didn't want to take out this powerful bishop. He simply retreated with the rook to b8. We have a bishop to b2. We have bishop to e7, and now knight to c3. We have Carlsen, queen to c2, of course, connecting the rooks, finishing the development here by Praggnanandhaa, and now b5. Now Magnus Carlsen is getting use of his 3 versus 2 pawn majority, because if we watch now the pawn structure, it's obvious that here white is a dominant position on the king side with this 4 versus 3, but black has, of course, a dominant position on the queen side with this 3 versus 2 situation. So that's why you have to play active where you're better. Magnus Carlsen used this moment immediately and placed b5. So now comes one of the critical moments of the game, believe me or not. So here's my question. You can play rook from a to d1 or rook from f to d1. Of course, you want to get one of these rooks on the file where already the queen is, but this is now really a $1 million question. Choose between rook from a to d1 or rook from f to d1. Which one is better in your opinion? Take your time and think about it, because I think playing with the rooks is one of the most important things that you have to recognize in the middle game stage. It's the hardest thing I think you can solve in your position, because sometimes you don't think about it. You just play rook move, you hope for the best, but actually there are huge differences with which rook you're playing. In my opinion, I'll answer this question. What my thinking process is about this rook from a to d1 or rook from f to d1. In my opinion, rook from a to d1 is much better instead of rook from f to d1. Why is that so? Because first of all, what we can notice, your queen is already on the c file. What we want to get is, of course, a control of the d file and a control of the e file. So now it's very hard to control the e file. Again, if you play, for instance, rook from a to d1, then you can play still rook from f to e1, and then you have a control of the e file. You can push e4, you can push e5, and now this pawn on the e file, I think, would become the main strength of white. So that's why with the support of a rook on the e file, white could have a pleasant game. But unfortunately, here rook from f to d1 was played by Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa, and you see now you can play maybe rook to c1, but the most important thing is for black that black can escape from any attacks of the rook. Black can play queen to b6, queen to a5, so you can still have good squares for the queen. It's not the point that you're trying again to play against the queen. I think the most important thing is to support now this bishop on d5 with the move e4. So in the potential rook from a to d1, maybe you could try h6, then e4, you see, and now after queen to c7, you could play this other rook on the e file, and now you have also some threats like e5. So I think that's much better. But as I said, rook from f to d1 was played by Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa, and you see the importance of the move rook from f to d1 in a couple of more moves, why it was sort of an inaccuracy here by the young prodigy Praggnanandhaa. So queen to c7, Magnus plays now this one. We have a4, although probably a4 is of course an idea to stop this progress. What you're hoping for is maybe this one, b4, and then after something like knight to e2, you're not allowing here your opponent to push the pawn on c4. You are blocking the potential pawn majority here of blacks. But actually a better idea instead of this move a4 would have been knight to g5, because what we want to get is maybe a trade of this knight, and we want to also for instance, deflect somehow maybe this knight from the defense of the h7. So in the potential, the line g6 would be sort of a must move already here for black. And now after move knight to e4, maybe black could go with the move b4, but now with knight to a4, knight to d5, rook to d5, I think the centralized knight gives, I think, a good game here for white. There are always also some threats of knight to f6 if you, for instance, leave the protection of this. So now, okay, you don't have anymore the bishop pair on the board, but actually your dark square bishop becomes the best minor piece of the board. So okay, but Praggnanandhaa played a4. He's challenging the pawn storm that black has here, this 3 versus 2 situation immediately. We have now h6. Magnus is saying you're not going to play knight to g5 again. Here h6, very important move, and we have now 8 takes b5, 8 takes b5, and now queen to e2, attacking the pawn on b5. Magnus protects it with queen to b6, and now e4. And you see now, you don't want to have the queen supporting the e4 pawn. That's now, I think, a huge problem in white's position. And imagine there was the rook on e1. That's now a huge difference, I think, because with the move queen to e1, Magnus Carlsen sends some blood immediately, and he plays now rook to e8. And you see now, if the rook would have been here, you wouldn't have any troubles, I think. You're protecting your e4 pawn. The knight is perfectly fine. The knight is centralized here around the square d5. So we have now really nice grip around that square. But now after move rook to e8, there are simply some nasty threats of knight to d5, e takes d5. If that happens, then maybe some discovered attacks. So here the queen on e2 is of course not on a good square. So here Praggnanandhaa realized his problems on the e file and played queen to d2. Although here there is a beautiful liberating move which you can play, bishop to a8. The bishop to a8 is beautiful because now you can play knight to d5. After knight to d5, you can still retreat. Again, centralize your bishop with bishop to d5. This was the move that I think Praggnanandhaa missed in order to keep the tension in the center of the board. Instead of this one, he played queen to d2, and now Magnus Carlsen plays simply bishop to f8. You see here he's keeping his pressure around the square e4, and you see now Praggnanandhaa has to defend his pawn with queen to f4. Although probably a better idea is again to play the rook on e1. Okay, you could have played this move rook to e1 a couple of moves ago, but it's simply time now, I think, to protect this very important square like this. And rook to e1, okay, maybe you lost some time, but it's playable again. I think it's an equal position for both sides. But after move queen to f4, here Praggnanandhaa exposed his queen a little bit. What he's probably hoping for is to deflect maybe somehow this knight or the queen from the defense of the rook. You see in a couple of more moves that the rook on b8 will become a tactical problem for Magnus Carlsen. But here after move queen to f4, Magnus plays now a beautiful move b4. And the problem is now the knight doesn't have good squares. Finally, this knight gets kicked away from the defense of the d5 square. We have a knight to a4 here by Praggnanandhaa. Although there is also an interesting line here, bishop to f7. Bishop to f7 is the sort of a tactic that I think could have surprised Magnus Carlsen, although it's maybe not the best of moves what you can play, but it was simply time, I think, for Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa to make something to happen here. Bishop to f7 would lead into this line, king to f7, and then knight to d5. Of course, you cannot take with the knight, you have to play something like queen to e6, but now knight to f6, we have g takes f6, you cannot take with the knight, of course, because of this tactical problem. As we said, the rook is hanging, so you could play g takes f6, but now rook to a7 would be very, very dangerous. I think the king has to escape. I think to g8 you can play maybe queen to g3. If you cover, then I think with knight to h4 you have some good chances maybe here to get the square f5. This could be maybe a beautiful position now for Praggnanandhaa. I'm not sure. As I said, it's something worth to study here. The engine, for instance, in this position gives equal chances for both sides after this sacrifice on f7. It's sort of a computer move that I analyzed at home. As I said, maybe it was something here for Praggnanandhaa, sort of a chance to get back into the game, but here he played knight to f4 and Magnus Carlsen sent some blood. As I said, he played knight to d5. We have rook takes d5. If you play, for instance, here knight to b6, it's not so good because you get knight to f4. Okay, you can take out this one, you can take out this one, then rook to d7. But here after rook to e4, here white is losing the pawn in the center of the board, and it's of course completely winning then for black. So here rook to d5 was played by Praggnanandhaa, queen to e6 here by Magnus Carlsen. We have rook from a to d1, and now rook to a8. We have queen to c1, and here queen to e4. The pawn is lost. There wasn't even a good way to protect it here. From this point on, Magnus Carlsen has a much better game. So you see, the e4 pawn became a problem, and Again, I'm pointing out I'm a little bit boring you, but again, this idea rook from a to d1 or rook from f to d1 caused, I think, many problems for Praggnanandhaa. Queen to e4, you see now Magnus grabs the pawn, has here 2 versus 1 situation, and really comfortable game. So h3 here, Praggnanandhaa created some breathing spaces. We have rook to a7. If you play rook to e1, it's of course not possible because of this one, queen to d5. You can maybe take out this rook, but now with bishop to b7, I think really that black is a dominant game, because after rook to a8, bishop to a8, and now after queen to c2, the problem is this move, queen to bishop to c6, and the bishop is basically trapping the knight, because now the serious threat is to move c4, and this pawn gets deflected maybe from the defense of the knight, so the knight is a little bit loose here on the board, on the edge of the board. It's, I think, a completely winning game then for black. So here h3, as I said, rook to e1 is not working. We have now rook to h7, we have queen to d2, we have queen to g6 here by Magnus Carlsen, and now knight to h4 by Praggnanandhaa. So Pragg is hoping now to get his knight on f5, and with the support of the bishop to create some madness around the square g7. So here Magnus Carlsen plays queen to e6, we have knight to f5 here. And now c4 played by Magnus. c4 is a risky move because, okay, bishop to b7 in my opinion slightly better here for Magnus, because you have to bring finally your bishop into the game, but still, even after c4, Magnus Carlsen is much better here. But after move bishop to b7, the only way to make something happen is here knight to h6, but after queen to h6, rook takes d7, but now with queen to g6, this is a beautiful position for the bishop pair. This light bishop is becoming the best minor piece of the board, so you have to play some weird moves like f4, but now after I don't know, c4 and bishop to c5, for instance, could happen. This bishop could come into the game. I think this is a beautiful position for black. Bishop to c6 is also an opportunity, and then bishop to a4. So too many tactical possibilities for black. So after move knight to f5, Magnus tried the c4 move, although as we said, bishop to b7 probably slightly better, but okay, c4. Here Pragg tried queen to d4, here attacking the rook and also creating some madness around the square g7, but Magnus Carlsen found a beautiful move, knight to f6. We have knight to b6 here by Praggnanandhaa. Again, probably knight to h6, the only move that prolongs the game a little bit for white, but after g takes h6, you can play queen takes f6, but the problem is now this one, c3, is locking now the long diagonal. You have to play bishop to c3, b takes c3, queen to c3, and from this point on, again, you see black is much better. Black has an extra piece on the board, so it's completely winning game here for Magnus. So after move knight to b6, it's even worse because c3 is happening. Now there are simply no tactical possibilities anymore for white. We have a knight takes c8, queen takes d5, queen takes d5. Here Magnus Carlsen calculated everything very well. Knight to d5, knight to a7, but now we have here c takes b2. We have rook to b1, and now after move rook to e2 in this position, Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa resigned, because the threat is of course knight to c3, and you have to give up the rook for a pawn. There was simply no hope anymore for the young prodigy. Okay, beautiful game. You see how these inaccuracies can cost you the game. Please consider every time a rook move. Rook moves are very important moves in chess. I have my trouble also in middle game stage where to place my rooks, how to play with them. I think this rook from a to d1, rook from f to d1 caused, as I said, in the middle game stage, many problems for Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa, but this was simply a beautiful game played by the world champion Magnus Carlsen. He played here really a dominant position in the center of the board. He used every piece in the attack. Really beautiful chess game here by Magnus Carlsen. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I really enjoyed it a lot. If you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my coverage so far with some brilliant games that we have analyzed before. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best of course.